Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Hope everyone on the call is doing well and appreciate you all taking the time out of the day to spend some time with us, learning more about resilience and the topic and kind of the meat behind the term of resilience, and then how we might apply that to food systems in a broader context, and then specifically what that might look like in Colorado. So my name is Matt Berry. I'm Chief Development Officer with the National Western Center. And for those who are new to the National Western Center, it's a brand new campus opening in 2024 in the heart of Denver. Along with the partners, Colorado State University, Western Stock Show Association, City and County of Denver, History Colorado, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we'll be working to advance a mission to convene the world around global food solutions. This is the home of the historic grounds of the National Western Stock Show. Being redeveloped, it started about 5 years ago. And in 2024, the physical doors were open. When the campus is complete, we'll have a new CSU campus referred to as Spur, a legacy building for the stock show, a new mile of riverfront, a public food market, and over 1 million square feet of space from large-scale venues to small-scale plazas and areas for convening. So the National Western Center, while it's a physical campus, we're actively working to bring our mission to life in the communities across the state and in partnerships with others. The work that we're doing is obviously rooted in Denver, but it's also rooted in our home state of Colorado. So we are focusing on making sure that we strengthen our regional food systems in our state. Part of that is being done through a project we actually applied through the Rockefeller Foundation called their 2050 Food System Vision. Our project is called How the West Was Won. It's a food vision. It's a 2050 food vision for Colorado. The key pillars of that work include building economic interdependence between our rural and urban communities, strengthening rural communities through economic development, increasing nutritional equity and food security, and then creating regenerative systems that improve our natural environment. So we have a broad 2050 stakeholder-driven vision that we're working to advance. Since the COVID outbreak, obviously everything shifted. And for us, we had the great privilege to join a group called the Colorado Farm and Food System Response Team. And we've been working on rapid response for Colorado's small and medium-sized producers with a strong focus on equity over the last 8 months. And within that, it just showed to us how fragile and rigid our current food system really is. And from supply chain disruptions for producers, selling to restaurants and schools and institutions, we've seen basically inability for us to weather short-term interruptions in our food system. Even more worrisome is the fact that the inequities in food insecurity, hunger, and other issues are only exacerbated when this pandemic hits. And I think that's kind of one of the things we'll get into in this conversation as well, as when we're talking about resilience for whom, and how do we make sure everyone is able to participate in a resilient and regenerative type of environment. So while we know that there's no short-term fix to a pandemic, we also, I think in the circles that we've been running in, the conversations we've had, there's been a lot of excitement about what could be and what transformation could look like in this opportunity where we've seen disruptions at such a kind of visible, front line of or front page of the newspapers about our food system. How do we take this as an opportunity to think about a transformative shift in our food system? And within that, we also know the term resilience comes up over and over and over. And I think in our minds, we want to make sure that if we're using the term resilience and we're thinking about a resilient future, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to create resilience in an equitable and prosperous system? So with that, we thought it would be a great grounding point to bring together folks whose focus on resilience in their daily lives, are kind of experts in the field who can share some of their insights about both resilience in the food system, and then application to Colorado. So we've brought together a great group of thinkers and doers from Colorado and across our great state to discuss the topic of resilience and applying that in our context. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our 6 panelists. First, we have Dr. Atyia Martin from All ACES and former Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Boston. Michael Berkowitz, Resilient Cities Catalyst, Rebecca Chesney from IDEO, Bobby Gill from Savory Institute, Dr. Damian Thompson from Frontline Farming and Regis University, and Rachel Landis from the Good Food Collective. So this is a great panel. I'm going to try to just stay in the background and make sure that keeping this conversation going, which should not be a problem. We had a pre-call in, was fascinated and inspired by the work everyone's doing. So here's what we're up to. We're going to start by grounding ourselves in resilience terminology frameworks, getting a little bit below the surface on what it takes to build resilience in communities and systems. We'll then move that thinking into a food system context. And then finally, we'll root that into Colorado to help local stakeholders in our state think about what we could be doing together to build more equitable, resilient food systems. So you all have hopefully already chatted your name and a little bit about yourself in the chat box, but we encourage you to use that to ask questions. Grace on our team will be compiling those questions for the Q&A later in the session. Also, feel free to share resources or other ideas and comments. So, participate in this panel or in this session wherever you have information that you can lend. So with that, I'm going to kick it off, and we're going to start with Atyia. So you have a wealth of building participatory resilience frameworks, and particularly in your role when you were Boston's Chief Resilience Officer. Could you spend a couple minutes just sharing a little bit more about your work, and then how do you define resilience, and what are the elements that go into developing a resilience framework?
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you, and thank you for hosting this. And I'm excited to be here with all of my wonderful panelists, fellow panelists. So the first question is really about, I'm gonna answer in two parts. The first question is, like, when we talk about resilience, what are we talking about from, where I sit? And then the second part is, how did I then apply that thinking to the work I was doing in the city of Boston when I was the Chief Resilience Officer? So the first part is resilience is a practice that is the researchers, my fellow nerds, I consider myself a pracademic, have kind of broken up into these, what they call domains. And so the first domain is infrastructure. It's the one we think about most often, the one we talk about most often. We have all these sophisticated risk analyses set up for them and all that good stuff. The next one is environmental, where that's kind of our focus today in the intersection of kind of the food system. The third one is how we think about the economy, so the economic impacts, both the macro and the micro. And then the last piece, or the two last pieces are social, which gets to kind of the human impact and the differences in those human impacts based on how we've structured our society. And then the final one is governance. And that's one that we definitely never talk about. I'm just starting to see in the last several years research on the resilience side around governance, not government, right? How we make decisions about how we plan for resilience, how we implement things around resilience, how we measure progress, who's holding who accountable, and how we are partnering and collaborating. So oftentimes we think about government as being kind of governance, but governance really is about decision-making. It's about ownership. Who is part of helping us determine which roads we go down as we're trying to figure out what resilience means in all of our different contexts. And then the last thing I'll say about that is it's such an important concept, because when we think about how we advance equity in our country, whether it's racial equity or any other kind of equity or social justice, it's important that we bring that thread throughout all of those different domains of resilience, not just social. And that tends to be the habit that we have, is that we put it in social and we're like, yeah, people stuff. So we don't need to think about it when we talk about the economy or when we talk about environment or we talk about these other domains of resilience. And so I'll land with the equity piece is so important to the conversation, because we can't claim to be resilient collectively in a jurisdiction, a city, an institution, if only some people or some functions have what they need in order to be resilient. And so for the idea of how we develop strategies, how do we look at the ways that we can address the short-term impacts, the long-term impacts, and chronic stresses, and all of those things that we're facing. When I was the Chief Resilience Officer, in co-creating the City of Boston's resilience strategy, we really worked hard to embed racial equity within the strategy. And really because that's what the data showed us. The data showed us that the biggest challenges that we face as a city at their core were the products of racism, right? In that we were by default of just doing what we've always been doing, perpetuating those inequities without meaning to do so. And so for us to disentangle all of that, it made sense to kind of, for the folks who think we're the content experts, to partner with the context experts in community to be able to co-create what does it mean for Boston to be resilient. So we rode the bus, we rode trains, we went to movie screenings, plays, everything you can think of where people were. We were there having these conversations and getting input and feedback from people, which brings me to my first big point around voice and choice. Right. So when we're talking about governance, that we have to make sure that the people who are impacted, especially the people who are disproportionately impacted, their voices are heard, but they're not just heard and we're not just listening like, okay, great, thanks for sharing your thoughts and moving right along as a checkbox, but that what they're saying is part of the decision-making process in a meaningful way, and that we're being transparent, that there are times when we can be fully and totally collaborative and open and from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. And there are other times where there are constraints that are external that limit our ability to be as collaborative as we want to be. And so how can we be transparent with folks? Because then they can help us troubleshoot through, well, yes, we know you have these constraints. However, there may be some other opportunities that we can't see that they can see in order to help us navigate with maybe how we do the things that there are limitations or restrictions on. So all of that said, I'm going to end with the reason choice and voice is so important. Anyone who's read any of the oppression literature or resistance literature or my favorite, Paulo Freire, that I have right here, one of my favorite books in the world. It's super beat up because for obvious reasons. But the big theme here is about dehumanization and the way he talks about dehumanization. And one of the biggest factors in dehumanization is turning people into objects, turning people into things that aren't we don't think about them as actual people who have agency, who have things to contribute, to be a part of decision-making processes. And therefore we take very paternalistic approaches in dealing with them. And it disproportionately applies to people who are part of underestimated groups, but we also see it as a common pattern in some of the dangerous trends in our democracy that we should all be concerned about.
Awesome. Thank you, Atyia. Yeah, and we're going to get into equity and engagement. And also, I think one of the questions which you don't respond to now, but it's coming in my head is when it comes to voice and choice in this role in not just voice, but also in decision-making, how do you sustain that type of engagement over the course of time so it's not a kind of point in time? I know, Rebecca, you have some thoughts on that as well. So Michael, great to have you here. Really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear both during your time with the 100 Resilient Cities and then Resilient Cities Catalyst, maybe share just a little bit about what those are as well for folks who maybe are newer to those projects. How do you define resilience in your sense, and what does it take to build the capacities? I know you've talked a lot about the underlying capacities that are required within resilience frameworks that are needed to survive or potentially even thrive during crisis.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt, and it's great to be here. And it won't come as a surprise to say that I resonate with a lot of what Atyia just said, given that when I was at 100 Resilient Cities and she was in Boston, we kind of taught each other about what resilience was. So we're coming in some ways from the same point of view. So hopefully I won't repeat too much of what she just said. But yeah, 100 Resilient Cities was an organization that was founded by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2013. It chose 100 cities around the world, helped them install chief resilience officers like Atyia in Boston, helped them do strategies and put them together in a peer-to-peer network to support each other in executing on those strategies. And we took a very broad view of resilience. And as Atyia mentioned, in Boston and actually in a bunch of cities around the US, racial equity was, if not the main entry point, a significant entry point to the resilience recession. But depending on where those cities were and what the key drivers were, it could have been a whole bunch of different entry points. It was not sustainability or climate or something like that. It could have been any number of shocks or stresses as a kind of entry point. In 2019, 100 Resilient Cities reorganized, and many of the sort of senior leadership of that organization created a new organization called Resilient Cities Catalyst, which is a nonprofit that is working to sort of drive this resilience conversation, work with cities and other entities to push this resilience conversation forward. Yeah, I think, you know, resilience for us has always been about a community's ability to survive, thrive, and in fact grow and improve in the face of stresses and disaster. And Matt, as you mentioned, that has to do with a set of core capacities that they have. The more they have these capacities, the more resilient they are. As Atyia mentioned, it's not an end state. It's a process, and you have more of these capacities or less of these capacities. And because our systems are so dynamic and our world is changing, we have to continue to work at those things in order to continue to be able to survive, thrive, and grow in the face of crisis. And I'll just to shorthand it a little bit for you, these capacities are broad, and many of the things Atyia mentioned, I'll say again, but you know, it has to do with community cohesion, where neighbors check on neighbors. It's diverse and equitable economies with strong middle-class jobs base. It's good public health systems. It's inclusive governance with strong stakeholders at the table. That's incredibly important. And all underpinned by sustainable multi-use infrastructure. All of these things help cities survive, thrive, and grow in the face of our challenges. And so it might be worth, you know, what I often hear is a resilient thing versus a resilience building thing. A resilient food system versus a resilience building food system. And those are related, but slightly different. A resilient food system is one that continues to function regardless of what the stress or shock is. If it's a flood or a fire or a drought or, you know, a pandemic or whatever, a resilient food system can continue to produce, distribute food. But because we know that these capacities that I just talked about are what make communities more resilient, a resilience building food system actually has the opportunity to contribute to a lot of those capacities. There's so much resilience building capacity in a food system potential. You know, you have equity, you have health, you have sustainability, you have jobs and economic development, all stuff you guys are talking about. All of this can be, you know, promoted and expanded if you take the right view of the food system. And so I think that's really where my thoughts around resilient versus resilience come down.
Great, awesome, thanks. So let's start getting a little bit more into the food context, and I'll start with Rebecca. And Rebecca, thanks for being here. Feel free to add anything in kind of definitional language in terms of resilience in your mind, but I'd also love to just hear a little bit about your background at IDEO and specifically in the kind of lab orientation that you have. How are you kind of bridging the topic of resilience with, you know, potentially large, unusual suspects in folks that are thinking about resilience on the corporate side with businesses you've worked with like Kroger and Danone and others? How have you started to bridge those resilience conversations into some of those other channels?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And a couple of years ago, I joined IDEO and started working on a program that's called the Circular Economy of Food CoLab. And if any of you are familiar with IDEO, IDEO for about 40 years or so has been at the forefront of thinking about design as a tool that can be applied to make change in the world. Initially starting with the design of products, and then over time, really expanding and evolving to design experiences and services, but also thinking about larger organizations and systems, taking a human-centered approach to understanding that there are people who have different roles as stakeholders inside an organization like a company or inside a system. How do you understand those individuals, their context, their needs, their desires, and kind of help align incentives and kind of design from a human-centered point of view for the kind of organization or system you're creating. And specifically, the CoLab that I'm working on is looking at how do we bring together different parts of the food industry. Given that the food industry is historically so siloed, there's a lack of sharing, and speaking of governance, the food industry, the private sector holds a lot of power. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is bring these organizations together so that they can work together at the really early stages of ideation and kind of building concepts and prototypes. So they can start to kind of see, what does it look like if we kind of get away from business as usual mindsets and actually start to imagine, what does a more biodiverse food system look like? What does a food system that relies less on plastic packaging, what does that look like? And what we're starting to see is that so many of the gaps are actually infrastructural in places where it's not any one organization that kind of has the purview. They must collaborate in order to make change. And then the other thing that we're also seeing is, I mentioned the background that IDEO has in human-centeredness. I think the food industry in particular has, I could say, maybe over-indexed a little bit on thinking of consumers, to Atyia's point around turning people into objects. I like to use the term eaters as opposed to consumers. They're people, but also thinking about how are we keeping the experiences and needs and impacts beyond just eaters? How do we think about the farmer? How do we think about the person who's working in the retail grocery store? And we've seen these essential workers, kind of their circumstances being kind of brought to the fore during the pandemic. And so one of the things we're really interested in is, how do we take the energy that's around that and keep that and kind of leverage that to create a different type of experience for all people across the food system. So the pandemic didn't create these problems. They were already there. The pandemic has just made them much more visible to many more people. So it's challenging, but it's really encouraging to see people who have built 20, 30-year careers in the food industry start to see that they need to do things differently and to try to find ways to take action. So we're starting to see a lot more energy around coming together and actually starting to figure out, what does this look like?
Great. Awesome. Thank you. So we could go two different directions here. Let's go shift to Damien. And Damien, appreciate you being here today. I'd love to have you share a little bit more about your work with frontline farming and the work you're doing. And I think a lot of what you're doing is humanizing actors across the food system, from the work that I know that you're doing, and you're doing a lot more than I know. The other topic that I'd love for you to talk about is, when we had our pre-call about resilience, I think, Damien, you brought forward a really important lens that resilience starts with the individual. And then that potentially enables the ability for communities and systems to have resilience within them. So I'd love for you to, again, share a little bit about Frontline, but then kind of share a little bit more about your philosophy on resilience, especially where the kind of origin point is in the process.
Sure. Thanks, Matt, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel with really interesting and esteemed colleagues. So Frontline Farming was established in 2018. We are a food justice, food systems, and farmer advocacy organization, women and POC led. And there's a lot in that whole story of how we came into being that has to do with equity and has to do with resilience. And, one of the things that I don't think we talk enough about is how we can build resilience into our organizations from the bottom up. And then also building equity in our organizations from the inside out. And so when you have organizations that are led by people of color, by Indigenous people, by women X individuals, it really allows us to really to infiltrate or to put those pieces into place from the very beginning. And so when we talk about being farmers ourselves, you know, as frontline farming, growing on 5 acres here in Denver and along the Front Range, we also recognize the connection between our work and our brother and sister farmers, you know, whether they be farmer owners, whether they be farm workers, whether they be migrant, whether they be H2A. And so really our work has centered on, I think, you know, as Atyia said, voice is a choice, or really kind of like creating centering the margins. And, you know, we've been able to do that through our educational process. You know, we do a lot of work in food access. We do work in food justice, which for us is really our policy piece, which is how we come to know Matt in the National Western Center. And then we also focus on food sovereignty and liberation, you know, and so education is a part of that, but really understanding, you know, that involves everything from foodways and understanding where our food comes from and how it supports our cultural legacies and our understanding of ourselves. And so, you know, Frontline really does focus in those areas of food access, food justice, and food sovereignty. And that allows us to have the perspective that led us to do the work that we're doing right now that I think is really important with Project Protect Food Systems and the statewide Promotora program that we're really utilizing to support some of the existing Promotora models, but then also to help develop Promotora models. And for those who aren't familiar, you know, Promotora is a program, a process that really started in Mexico in the 1970s and then moved into the United States and started to be incorporated in various levels. And it's really about, you know, finding the opportunity to get resources to people who are doing really important work on the ground and supporting the resilience of themselves and their families and their communities. So it's been really a blessing to have the opportunity to partner with organizations, to partner, to travel to different parts of the state and sit and have meals and understand the local geography of the places where we're trying to build partnership, build relationship, and then also help to build resilience, you know, that is a statewide thing. So, you know, that's kind of a brief synopsis of Frontline. And I want to make sure I get to the piece about resilience. You know, I did talk about resilience as being something that I believe manifests in the individual. I believe it exists at, you know, multiple scales, at multiple levels at the same time, right? Individual, household, community, city, and so forth. I did want to say, I think that there are aspects or probably qualities that can exist along all 3 or 4 of those kind of spectrums. You know, I was thinking as other folks were talking about the necessity on the individual level for things to be healing and relationship based, you know, but then also when you start to take that to different levels, I also relate it to land, you know, to things being land and people based. So when you're talking about individuals, you know, that connection with the land, oftentimes in Frontline, when we talk about the relationship that we can have with land, especially as people of color, we're talking about our healing, you know, from some pretty significant historical dislocation from land. And from our land-based practices, it was really violent. So I think that, you know, on multiple levels, we need that healing, but it needs to be land and people-based. That resilient system needs to be land people-based. It was very much in terms of, like I said, the whole idea of voice is choice, elevating and amplifying voices of marginalized people within the food systems, within our societies, you know, creating opportunities and creating, you know, and making the effort, not making the effort, but creating the opportunity to really understand what it is that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, not just as a, you know, 1 or 2 community gatherings, but as a consistent and engaged mode of understanding what folks are going through. I really think equity and opportunity is key. especially economically. And, you know, the more that I think about rural communities and what's happening in rural communities, when we talk about rural economic development, we should also be talking about equity, you know, and how are we creating opportunities and pathways for folks who have been farming, but not farm owners, to become farm owners, and to really, you know, those are the folks that are really supplying the lifeblood to a lot of our rural communities. And so I think that economic opportunity has to be there. And then I think lastly, supporting economies of solidarity and resilience. And I think that there are a lot of individuals who are doing work right now on the ground to support, whether it be through food access, whether it be in rural communities as promotores, but not in that name, not given that title. There are people who are doing that work. And so we need to figure out and leverage systems, leverage governance, leverage economic systems, leverage economy, and leverage infrastructure to be supporting those resilient systems that people are already creating for themselves and really need to be nurtured and supported. And like I said, I think that, you know, you can take those ideas, those principles, and really think about them from on the individual level, you know, extending through. So I think it's really important to make that connection. And then the last thing I think I'll say to agree with Michael and Atyia is it's a practice, it's a discipline, it's something that needs to be done every single day and consistently on the individual level, but then also at all of these other levels simultaneously. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Damien. All right, we got two more kind of personal intros, and we're going to dive into some deeper topics. So Bobby, wanted to turn it over to you. And I think, you know, Rebecca was talking about how do you build resilience in these networks across the supply chain? And I know that's something that Savory has been working on, especially really intently over the last year. But love to hear a little bit more about Savory Institute, for those who don't know what you do and what you're all about. And maybe share a little bit more about some of the newer initiatives that you have running that are specifically about kind of connecting producer to processor to individual consumer, and then kind of tie those themes of regenerative ag, holistic management into the same language we're using in resilience, and see if there's ways to kind of use some of those terms in ways that relate back to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Just first want to start off, you know, I've seen in the chats some questions about land acknowledgement. I live about 2 miles south of the National Western Center, and so I know that, you know, we sit on Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne territory, so just giving an acknowledgement to that land. You know, I do feel that a connection to place is critically important towards understanding it and what it needs. That is central to the Savory Institute's mission. So we are a nonprofit headquartered in Boulder, but we work all across the globe with farmers, ranchers, and pastoralists of all different types. Essentially, we help those types of people, we empower them to be able to manage their land in a way that helps regenerate grassland ecosystems through holistic decision-making and better grazing planning and management. You know, we work with folks like the Maasai in Kenya, or Gauchos in Patagonia, or reindeer herders in Norway, or cowboys here in the West. So, you know, all different types of backgrounds and perspectives, but really they all have that common thread of grazing herbivores on grasslands, which, you know, grasslands and herbivores co-evolve together. So that's what we focus on. When we do our work at Savory, the aspect of resilience for us is acknowledging that we, as, you know, 12 employees in a small nonprofit based in Colorado, do not know the unique needs of everyone across the globe and what is necessary or what structures are needed. And it's impossible for us to find that knowledge and to distribute that down to each one. And rather, we operate through what we call a hub model. And so we have local learning centers that exist in all places around the world. They're locally owned, they're locally operated. They just earn accreditation through us, and we provide support to them. And that way they can take the tools that we provide and the programs that we can provide, and they can adapt them towards a localized context based on what the local geography, climate, politics, social norms, etc. are. They can do that in a way that's appropriate for the local peoples, that truly benefits the local people, and it's done through a transfer of knowledge that is peer-to-peer and not this top-down outside organization coming in and saying what is necessary. And when you do something of that nature, we find that it really brings this beautiful diversity of approaches towards this global network that we have operating. And you know, so our global network is the ecosystem that we operate. You know, this discussion we're having here today is about the Colorado food ecosystem, but you know, we kind of see those as, you know, whole ecosystems that are nested within other whole ecosystems, and that diversity is needed across the board. You know, diversity can be seen in a variety of lenses in terms of, you know, a diversity of species that are being grown on a property. So on a ranch, you've got a diversity of grasses that are growing, and that breeds resilience because, you know, different plants are going to have different ecosystem benefits that they provide in terms of the minerals that they're bringing in, or, you know, what function they have on that piece of land. But diversity also can be seen not just in biodiversity of species or crop production, but also diversity of approaches and business models or impact models that you see in an area, so that when something like COVID comes into play, you've got a diversity of approaches that you can look to and say, okay, which are the ones that are performing the best right here, and how can we learn from that, and how can we then scale that out to others so that we aren't reliant on one single individual approach. Similarly, diversity of opinions and perspectives in an organization. You know, I think there was a phrase or a specific word that Atyia, you said in your piece earlier, co-creating. And that, I think, is so incredibly important for resilience in terms of bringing multiple voices to the table and not just hearing them, but ensuring that everyone is an active player in the creation process. That's going to bring about new ideas, new perspectives, new thoughts. And, you know, ultimately resilience is to help us, you know, stay protected. So when things hit the fan, we ultimately survive in the long run. If you've got a diversity of experiences and perspectives, and you're trying to build a system that is in service to all people, having those different voices at the table, empowered, active players in whatever you're doing, that's going to breed resilience across the board. To get more towards your specific question, Matt, of what is Savory Institute doing lately, you know, we have been focused in a big part in the marketplace. You know, so in terms of regenerative agriculture, we've identified a weakness is that there is not a way for producers really to differentiate their products, allow consumers to vote with their dollar in support of regenerative agriculture. So we've identified that pain point, and we've been working on ways to create that differentiation in the marketplace. We've created a program where we are essentially connecting regenerative producers towards brands and other marketplace partners that allow those products to come into the marketplace differentiated. You know that they're regenerative. What we found, though, is that when you look at a lot of, say, certifications that are out there, you know, organic, non-GMO, fair trade, et cetera, they are all well-intentioned. They're all fantastic programs in their own right, but they're essentially a checklist of things that you can and cannot do. And when you have that, you're basically putting producers into a box and saying, this is all that you can do. And I know that you have your own unique perspective according to your localized context and, you know, the local indigenous wisdom or whatever it may be of what's necessary for that land base, but you have to remain in this box. It doesn't allow for the freedom of choice and adapting towards the local conditions. And because of that, you get things like organic, which has now become more of industrial organic, which really flies in the face of what it was originally intended for. You know, the system will find ways of co-opting certifications when they go out there. So we believe that rather than this top-down certification approach, a pivot towards focusing on outcomes-based certifications or verifications is ultimately going to be in the best interest of everyone, because it allows for that unique context to truly be expressed. It allows for a producer to do what is truly needed on their land, in their community, what's needed on a season by season basis, depending on the changing conditions of the environment. When you focus on outcomes, it allows people to really put forward their creativity and their innovation of how they can manage their land and do so in the way that is best for them and their community. So we're measuring outcomes on the land, and really having that outcomes-based focus. And that's pivotal for us, because when we are connecting these regenerative producers and creating these regenerative supply chains, connecting brands and producers, we don't want to do so through this, hey, it's been given the Savory stamp of approval just because we say so. We have measured outcomes. We have proven that there is a positive trend line in the various ecosystem processes. And we're not just looking at one individual thing like soil carbon. We're taking a holistic approach, looking at a variety of above ground and below ground indicators, both leading and lagging indicators. So, producers are able to say with verifiable data, my land has gotten better. I've done so in a manner that is ecologically appropriate for my area. And then we connect them in with brands and other types of supply chains, which is great because it gives new marketplace incentives for producers to find outlet for their product. Price premiums are something that is a component, but we're not entirely basing our entire program off of that, because we know that premiums can go away. And so you can't build a program entirely around those. It has to be that they are engaging in a program because of a variety of things that are important to the producer. So that's really the approach that we've been taking lately. And that ties back in to the point you were asking about of holistic management. That's the framework we teach. It is truly taking a holistic perspective, looking at the land, the people, the economies, and having that decision-making framework so that people can truly make decisions in a way that is appropriate to your unique context, and acknowledging that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach towards land management or any type of natural system for that matter.
Great, thank you. And perfect segue to Rachel. Rachel, awesome to have you here with the Good Food Collective, based out of Durango in Southwest Colorado. And one of the things I know we've talked about and I've heard you share around is Southwest Colorado has a very unique geography with some specific kind of geographic barriers that isolate it from other parts of the state. The fact that it's fairly far removed from any major metropolitan area. And one of the things that you had shared, and it's great segue from Bobby's comments, is you mentioned this fierce independence within your regional food system, and how do you build a food system that's resilient in your local context, but one that doesn't foster more isolation from the rest of the kind of neighbors across the state and country. So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about Good Food Collective, and then maybe talk about what resilience in your kind of regional resilience food building mindset looks like in a portion of the state that has such a kind of unique geographic elements and cultural elements within Southwest Colorado communities.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having us here. It's a real honor, and I've just been madly scribbling notes and listening to everyone, and also learning from the chat. So thank you all for being incredible teachers. My name is Rachel, and we're down here in southwestern Colorado. And the Good Food Collective, it's built into our name. We are truly a collective working with stakeholders and community members across all sectors of our food system to build an intact regional food system. And I think one of the things we've found that is important to resilience, but also is just important to respecting the diversity of even just a tiny little place like southwestern Colorado, is that you have to be able to incorporate many perspectives and many different ways of being. And so we don't put firm definitions around necessarily what an intact food system looks like. We also don't put definitions around what our region is. It really shifts based on, it's more of a food shed approach than it is certainly bordered by any sort of like lines in the mind of a state boundary or a county boundary or a reservation boundary. And we really think about things in terms of how people, information, culture, resources flow. And yeah, I think within that work, I'm just looking at some of the resilience frameworks that have been put out here. And we've really started from this place of building out that social fabric. And it's honestly been a lot of, I would say, community organizing. And so Damien mentioned this, just going to meals and sitting and listening. And just trying to pull up in our little geographic region down here, what are all the different food systems within a food system that exist here? What are the cultural perspectives? If you're at 8,500 feet, what's your food system vantage versus if you're at 6,500 feet and maybe have water for 27 days versus 16? And so, yeah, to your point, Matt, for those of you who've been down here in southwestern Colorado, we're almost like cut off by a half moon circle of mountains. And so we have the San Juan Mountains, with Wolf Creek Pass kind of forming this very natural geographic barrier between us and the San Luis Valley. And then if you follow those mountains all around, they ring us and cut us off from the Montrose Hotchkiss Paonia kind of grow zone. And then they circle all the way out down into Utah and beyond. And so we are a mix of high alpine or high desert plateau. We've got riparian zones. It's just a very blended thing. And I think because of the way our geography has kind of ringed us in, we actually would identify more with the kind of cultures to a certain extent, and certainly also to the infrastructure and resource flows that are coming from New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And yeah, I just think it's been really interesting. We are 7 hours from Denver, up and over 3 mountain passes, 6.5 hours to Salt Lake. I don't know how many mountain passes that is. It's a couple of mountain passes to get over to Albuquerque. And so I think because we're a bit isolated and also a bit remote, over time, and I should also say we are home to 3 sovereign nations in this area. And just, I think because of that, there is very much a sense of self-reliance and self-identification. And there's all these little bubbles, if you will, down here that are fiercely independent. And when we talk about a food system down here, it isn't really necessarily about how we're going to scale up to an industrial system that supports an industrial way of living and an industrial income so that we can connect to the food sheds of Albuquerque and sell into those markets. It really is from a place of how do we sustain our community down here. So I think a lot of the conversations that are around resilience are between our different growers on the production side, and starting to get to a place where we're figuring out, well, what do we do? How can we leverage all these different elevation zones and different types of soil and watersheds that we have to be able to grow crops so that, for instance, this year Mancus got slammed with grasshoppers. So we can kind of shift and look over and shift our distribution to what we have going on more closer to Bayfield. Additionally, you know, with here, one of the big things that's coming up in conversation, and I'm really excited to see there's a lot of movement and energy around the Ute Mountain Ute group, as well as our Southern Ute tribal entities, are really looking to restore by their farming systems and their farm sheds and sovereign ways of being and knowing, and how do we set up land for that. So it's been a really interesting moment to kind of maintain, how do you maintain your independence and honor that deep part of the culture down here, at the same time realizing that it's a tiny system. It can't actually, or at this point doesn't support itself. There's a lot of systemic problems when it comes to access to land, water, the climate changing, etc. So how do you kind of marry that fierce independence with a system that also needs to be interconnected? And I was just thinking about, like, listening to how everyone's talking here. There's so much beautiful and brilliant ideation and language, and how that necessarily wouldn't tie in here. It might feel a little bit removed. And so how do you mesh those two things in a way that honors the validity of both?
Awesome, thank you. So I want to take a pause here, and now that everyone's had a chance to talk a little bit about their work and perspectives. Any brief comments, insights, or from any of you, based on what others said, any questions that you have for your fellow panelists? We'll maybe kind of spend a minute or two there. I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience as well. And I definitely want to get a little bit more into the Colorado context. We want to pause here if anyone's kind of has something burning that they want to share or a question that they're burning that they want to ask someone else on the panel.
Just briefly want to say, because I didn't define it and we haven't really defined it. And so I'm going to just very briefly say that when we talk about equity, that we're talking about just like resilience as a practice, so is equity. And if we don't incorporate it from the beginning, then it doesn't happen, right? So if we're not intentional about it, it doesn't happen. And so when we talk about equity, we're talking about shifting mindsets. There's a lot of ideas that have fueled what supports the system of racism. We're talking about understanding how those ideas have infected us and how to relearn who we are and how we want to be in the world, how that has impacted the way we see each other, and how we engage with each other when we interact with one another, and then how it shows up in organizations, that all three of those things show up in organizations, and that the organization itself then has another layer of impact around policies, programs, culture, and then all of those organizations as part of different systems. In this case today, we're talking about food systems, then stack on top of one another to create structural barriers. And so how do we make sure that we're being as proactive and intentional as possible to think about all of the ways that we need to shift our thinking, our behavior, and how we're making decisions.
Yeah, and I have a bit of a build on that around intentionality. You know, when it comes to the food systems context, you often hear or read people talk about the food system as being broken. And in our work, we've been really intentional around saying the food system, it's not working. That doesn't necessarily mean it's broken. That might mean that the way that we have designed the structure of the food system, it's not built to serve everyone. But when something breaks, it kind of takes away a little bit. It's like, oh, this it's broken. It just happened. It actually didn't just happen. Decisions and policies, et cetera, that have been made over decades have led us to where we are today. So kind of bringing in the intentionality around what is it that we're actually trying to build towards? Are we trying to just fix something that we think is broken, or are we trying to actively and intentionally build something that is equitable and regenerative and nourishing for everyone?
There's a piece coming up to me, you know, looking at things through the lens of biomimicry. You know, you look at an ecosystem, whether it's a land base or a group of people or an economy or whatever it may be, all, you know, a group of living organisms interacting with one another. And a regenerative ecosystem is distributed and diverse and interconnected and nodal and replicating. All of those pieces are part of that underlying foundation of a healthy functioning ecosystem. And resilience is an emergent property of a healthy functioning ecosystem. So you can try to focus on the resilience piece, but really if you want to get resilience, you need to acknowledge that you need to take care of that foundational piece of what truly a regenerative ecosystem needs in terms of decentralized, nodal, distributed, interconnected, replicable, et cetera. And when you take care of that foundational piece, the emergence of resilience is going to be an outcoming of that. Same way that when you manage a land base, yes, maybe you care about soil organic carbon, but that's just one piece of a healthy functioning ecosystem. You need to look at the water cycle. You need to look at the mineral cycle. You need to look at the energy flow, how much photosynthesis is being captured by the land. You need to look at the community dynamics of all the different species that are symbiotically interacting with one another. And when you take care of those functional ecosystem processes, then the soil organic carbon or the water holding capacity or whatever it may be, those things all get taken care of. So just a reminder from this, living systems lens to focus on the foundational pieces of what make a properly functioning ecosystem.
Yeah, I just wanted to, excuse me, kind of a continuation of Rebecca's point. And it's interesting, that you talk about it in that way, because when we talk about the food system, we say the food system works exactly like it's supposed to in a capitalist context, right? Especially when you're talking about the impact that it has on both land and people. And especially kind of, as Atyia said, reflecting on the intentionality of building it in from the beginning, and recognizing, the comment by Shannon Francis and the comment about, land acknowledgement. And Shannon is a teacher that we know well. She's taught in my classes. She's done land acknowledgement at our various events, and we consider her to be a friend and a partner. So even thinking about and really reflecting on that, like, that would, to take that kind of critique seriously, right? And then to figure out what is the best mechanism for engaging with, again, communities of people that historically have deep roots, but are completely marginalized and made invisible in, in the actual functioning of the food system and otherwise, and really start to understand and ask ourselves, what does it mean to not share power in the sense, but what does it mean to give over power to, in order to acknowledge and to create space? So I just think it's, when we're talking about the food system, I mean, I just think it's really important to recognize that, like, it is supposed to work this way. It marginalizes people and displaces people, and it has, like, since the very beginning of the capitalist enterprise. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, exactly. It's extractive, not just environmentally, but economically, socially, in probably every one of these domains that Atyia listed out at the beginning. Our food system is kind of designed to be extractive at the industrial scale.
Yeah, it's Damien, I've heard you make that comment before, and every time I hear it, it's so sobering to me, just the fact about that kind of amount of transformation that's required to undo a system that's not unintentionally built the way that it's operating today. So I think that's a really important comment. Like I said, every time I hear it, it sticks with me. So I want to shift. I know as we promised on the panel, this is also a Colorado conversation. Rachel, I think you did a great job sharing a little bit more around the Southwest Colorado context. Damien, could you keep going for a minute and just share a little bit more around, and I'm going to steal Morgan's question from the chat box, because it's basically exactly what we're asking. What do you see as the big gaps in Colorado's journey creating resilient building systems? What are the greatest barriers, and how can small and community-based organizations plug into the collaborative work?
Well, in some cases, I would say, to refer back to Rachel, geography in Colorado is a significant barrier to maybe not resilience on the local level, but certainly a statewide understanding and some commonalities around resilience and maybe how we're trying to build it. I think that, for me, what I've experienced, and I'll just use one example that I think is salient for all of us, is discursive, right? And we talk about the urban-rural divide a lot. And I think in Colorado, the urban-rural divide is probably as salient an argument with Denver, in the Front Range, and then you have the rest of the state, which is, pretty rural, in some cases, pretty agriculturally based. And in my experience, the notion of the urban-rural divide is not actually meant to articulate the experience of all Coloradans, right? I would make the argument, and we have made the argument in the past, that that's more about white Coloradans, right? And so there's a sense that there's this urban-rural divide between white folks, right, where you have rural farmers who have, like, these issues that are, that are many, right, but that they are somehow, contrasted with the policy makers on the Front Range in Denver and otherwise. But when you really think about it in terms of communities and oppressed people and marginalized people in urban and rural spaces, we're talking about issues around labor. We're talking about issues around access to food. We're talking about issues around access to healthcare. We're talking about issues around access to economic opportunity, right? And so I just think that, you know, this discursive, it's a space that's made it really difficult to have some of these conversations, I guess is what I'm saying. And, you know, just to point to that as one example that maybe many of us also can relate to. And I think that it makes it more difficult in terms of community organizations. It makes it more difficult for community organizations to really reach out in a way that is consistent with, say, our desire to build cooperative models, right? And it makes it necessary, you know, like we did this weekend with the Project Protect Food Systems, to go out to, you know, to Grand Junction and participate in part of the training for the promotores, to, you know, but because we cannot allow those ideas and those concepts to continue to divide people who need to be looking for ways to make common cause. We need to be looking for ways to share information and think about ourselves and our communities as assets and resources, right? So if we can, from the front range, leverage resources and bring resources into other communities, not so that we can dictate how those resources are used, but, you know, so that those folks that are doing that work on the ground can deem that, then we're getting something back from them, you know. So we really have to understand that from the grassroots comes information, comes that analysis that they have on that level. And so it's really about, you know, breaking down those barriers that, to me, like I said, are really theoretical and conceptual, to allow us to do the real work of knitting together, as Bobby talks about, these webs of interconnected nodes of resilience that support one another. So, you know, I'm happy to answer a follow-up question, but that's just kind of my initial thoughts.
Rachel or Bobby, what would you add? You know, Bobby, you didn't mention as much about Cold Harbor or West Bijou. Some of the work, I mean, Savory also has strong presence in Colorado. And Rachel, I know you I think crafted a great picture of Southwest Colorado. Other elements that you want to kind of share about the kind of what makes Colorado unique? Like, where do we have unique opportunities, and where are some of the unique barriers that confront our state would be super helpful to hear.
Sure. Well, you know, I mentioned Savory's global network. Our local learning hub here in Colorado is the Cold Harbor Institute. It's an organization based out of Western State College in Gunnison. So they are the local Savory hub that's working with farmers and ranchers across the state. You know, so they really, it's funny, you know, people always come to me at Savory Institute and, you know, ask to weigh in on certain issues. I'm like, well, don't ask me, you know, let's ask the local people, the ones that are actually dealing with the producers in the local area, because they know the needs better than I do. You know, I know a little bit about everything, but not enough in a particular area to be able to probably speak eloquently as well as you all here on the panel can. I do know that, well, and also to add, you mentioned West Bijou, that is Savory Institute's bison ranch. So about 45 minutes east of Denver, we've got a 7,500 acre bison ranch, 400 head of bison out there. We use it as a learning center, training facilities where people come out and learn grazing management. I think the unique opportunities that we have within Colorado, like was said with the geography, you know, on the western slope, very different from what we have on the eastern plains. You know, Colorado is a part of the country that, you know, what Savory Institute we would call a brittle landscape. So there is a distribution of moisture availability throughout the year. So we have a very distinct growing season and a very distinct non-growing season. And that's quite different from places that you see in like coastal areas where there's moisture year round and it's very lush and green, and they can have these multi-species operations with, you know, intercropping and all sorts of stuff working together. That becomes more difficult to do in a Colorado landscape, and you have to manage it a little bit differently. You know, one way that plays out, you know, we work in the grazing space. So working with ranchers, you know, someone who wants to raise 100% grass-fed, grass-finished beef, well, it's possible to grass-finish beef in Colorado, but it's quite difficult because of the availability of forage. Economically, it's a little difficult to do so if you're on non-irrigated land. So oftentimes you see a lot of people that are running cow-calf operations and then sending those animals out to get finished elsewhere in a more non-brittle landscape like Wisconsin or Minnesota or somewhere coastal where it makes more sense to finish them on grass. And so I think recognizing the limitations of what is possible in the ecosystem that we find ourselves in, and creating food systems that embrace that, but then also tie into the uniqueness of other food systems that are complementary to ours in ecoregions outside of our own, outside of the Eastern Plains shortgrass prairie, and saying, okay, well, we're good at this, but we have a lacking of this. Well, what are the tangential food systems to us, and what do they have that we could complement one another and trade? I think, kind of playing that food system game of Tetris, can really help in terms of allowing you to really tap into what makes your area unique, and really doing that to the fullest and allowing others to do the same. So having that piece of cooperation.
Great. Rachel, we're going to turn to questions here, but Rachel, anything else you want to add before we kind of open it up to questions from the audience?
I think just one thing, to the question you posed about what are some of those distinct or unique opportunities that we have here, the quote unquote dichotomy of the urban rural divide, or kind of everything centered in the Front Range, and then there's the rest of the state sort of piece. The beauty of that is that there is this immense kind of powerhouse of technology and education and wealth and knowledge just up in our state, at the same time that you have very deep place-based committed people and knowledge kind of all across the state, coupled with a deep rural understanding of what's going on, historic and contemporary. And then we have a vast, deep wealth of indigenous knowledge here as well. And so, when you look at just kind of the social assets, it's tremendous. And so I think the barrier there, whether it's due to geography, cultural distinction, otherwise, is, do we have the intercultural competence to look below the waterline of like, here's, the differences, to be able to really lean in on the unique advantages each of those perspectives plays, and apply it based on context in the moment and what's called for, right? Are we applying the technology and resources in the right moment, or is that a time for story and tradition and sharing in that way, or vice versa? So I think that's one piece that comes in. And I also think something that's really worth mentioning here, and the moment is now, but we have so many folks on this call really engaged and invested in food systems. There's a values base there. That's not the case. I'm from farming stock in Iowa. That is not the case there. It's, corn and soybeans are king. You can't even get a vegetable. And so I think that is an amazing opportunity that we have. And based on y'all's work and a lot of the things they're seeing around the state, we are taking advantage of that. So I hope we continue to do so.
Great, thanks.
Matt,
go ahead, Michael.
Could I just echo what Rachel just said, because I think it's super important. 2 points. One is, in terms of opportunity, we're at this incredible turning point that we haven't totally acknowledged, where we've had incredible awareness around, this incredible shock around COVID, which has caused an awareness of the vulnerability and the importance of our food systems, and other things too. Obviously, we've had this awareness around systemic racism, police violence, Black Lives Matter, and we've had a truly awful climate year with fires and storms, and we're only in October. And out of that will come an opportunity to really re-envision the way things are done, both in terms of sustainability and equity and others. So I think there is, and there will continue to be, hopefully, an incredible opportunity, and whether that comes in the US context of, stimulus and Green New Deal and whatever, the sort of national level impetus is, there will be things on the state level and at the local level. So I think out of this crisis comes an incredible opportunity. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing that really resonates with me as a non-Coloradan is what Rachel said in terms of all of the energy and the focus and the expertise that is there in Colorado, which is not in lots of other places. And I'll give you the New York perspective, but I went back and worked 3 months for the New York City Office of Emergency Management in the acute phase of the crisis. And I worked for someone who had just been appointed the city's food czar. And I did emergency feeding. But the point of this story is that a city like New York, which has sort of on a normal year, a $90 billion annual budget between capital and operational, does not have a person and an office designed to look at the entire food system. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, they have certain little bits, a single policy advisor to the mayor, or people who are responsible for purchasing, school meals or whatever. But no one's looking at the whole value chain between production, distribution, and ultimately emergency feeding and waste. And so, acknowledging all of the amazing resources that you have, and really being a model for what other states, counties, regions, communities need going forward, I think is something you should also view as a true opportunity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we could talk for the rest of this session about Colorado easily. I think one of the questions that comes to my mind too, and this has come up a lot in the work that we've been doing with the Farm and Food System Response Team, is where is the state the right system that we're talking about, and where are there regional food systems within the state that are potentially the more appropriate geographies to be talking through. The Colorado is a Western state with just a big rectangle drawn years ago that connects lots of other just large land masses. Like, how does it operate as a quote food system that's driven more by, I think, policy than it is a natural food system that would operate, where you're drawing a line between Colorado and Kansas. That's arbitrary from the way that food's growing on kind of east or west of that line. And I think that's a question that comes up for me that I'm just constantly kind of exploring in my own mind. So I'm going to turn to questions that we've been collecting from the chat box. The first one, which I know we've talked about, and I think a lot of us have talked about the resilience building aspect of this, and that if you don't engage in the outset, what are you building resilience around, and who's informing that? There's a question around how might we get eaters and consumers more engaged in the critical questions in our food system, like resilience. I'm going to broaden that one step. Maybe it's actually a very big step. But how do we also get producers at the table, and producers who aren't necessarily thinking about the term resilience, at least not in the context of this type of conversation? How do we make sure that we're listening with voice and choice on the kind of as we think about developing resilience? But again, I appreciated lots of different comments, both this and in our pre-call, around it's not enough to just engage voice and choice at the beginning. This is a process that has to be enduring for those stakeholders to stay at the table. So I'd love to, anyone can volunteer to pick this one up from the top. I'd love to just hear some responses around how to get those kind of core constituencies, eaters, consumers, producers, engaged in the right ways at these critical, as you just described, Michael, this turning point. Like, how do we do it now, not a year from now or 6 months from now, after we've all been trying to figure out what transformation looks like? So I'd love to, I see Atyia, you're off the mute box, so I'm going to start with you and then others can weigh in.
Super quickly, I mean, one of the things that I think is a false assumption, and I see this pattern in any conversations around climate change, or in this case, food systems, that people don't care or aren't aware, or, just this, that they just don't know. And some people don't know, right? And the goal is to figure out how to partner with folks in a way that is a bi-directional exchange, right? Where there are things that people have to contribute, even if they don't know all the technical jargon or, all the other stuff that the words we use, but that we're creating that relationship right from the beginning, and that where we have clear goals. So one of the things that oftentimes happens is we just kind of like say, oh, we need to be inclusive. And so we're just going to be inclusive. And then by the end of it, we weren't, because we didn't have any goals, and we didn't define what that meant and how it was going to be baked into the whole process. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think one of the opportunities that we have is to create the kind of learning experiences that go outside of how we usually think about how people learn. I think a lot of times we think about education from I have all the knowledge and I'm going to pour it into you, right? Or we, even if we don't believe that, we behave in ways that's what we believe. And so how do we have more engaging, more interesting and like I said, bi-directional exchanges that mimic how we actually learn in real life, and not kind of what we kind of usually do, which is we'll do a presentation and then we're like, people ask us questions, and it's like, no, these are these are people's lived experiences. And so how do we do things in a way that builds off of people's knowledge about their lived experiences and start from that as a place of learning, and that goes both ways.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, great points. Rachel, did you have your hand raised on that question? Or Rebecca?
I do. Oh,
go for it, Rachel.
Well, I'll just add in kind of from a newbie practitioner on this one, a couple of things. We have a food systems and equity group that formed up in October and has been working through now COVID and beyond, really crafting together kind of a joint vision for what our food system, what it would look like to truly be equitable and support health equity. And some of the things, just learning on the ground, to your point about language and not letting jargon or concepts be a barrier, because these are all things we're engaged in and doing. And so how can we share language on something? I think also it has to be relevant, right? And I think that's what you're saying in the two-way exchange. But, right now we're working deeply with our Latinx community, and like planning, big picture planning around things, is that really as relevant as trying to work on immediate needs and community infrastructure and support? And I think one of the other really big ones that I've learned the hard way is just that in addition to making sure there's that two-way exchange and building off of lived experience, it's also sharing and making sure there's space for different ways of processing and moving through things and ways of thinking. A lot of our Indigenous community can be circle thinkers and speakers. And so whereas I tend to be A leads to B leads to C, let's process this way, that does not work for a lot of different people. And so making sure to clear out and let other folks facilitate and bring things to the table in the way that it works for them. And then also just having strong facilitation, honestly, in the in-between to help everyone kind of join in and be able to participate as they're able, so that people see equal value in all these ways of doing things.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I love the framing around reciprocity, especially when it comes to education and learning. I think I've heard a few people on the panel mention context being really important, and maybe that's the food anthropologist in me. You always have to look at context and understand kind of people's environment and where they're coming from. Because I think the challenge that I often wrestle with when it comes to consumers and and eaters and people as individuals in the food system, I think this is one place where there's a lot of work to be done around kind of helping people see their connection to the larger food system, the environment, et cetera. But I also have there's a tension around also putting too much burden on individuals to be able to purchase these foods and do all of these things when foods that are produced conventionally are kept artificially cheap. Or, in the context of, there have been worries for a long time around getting people to cook more. And I've always thought, well, if you want to do that in the US, we also have to look at childcare and these other things that are barriers to people being able to engage in the food system in a different way. So I think we just need to keep in mind healthcare, childcare, all of these other systems that help shape the context in which people do engage with the food system. And we might find a leverage point somewhere else that can help drive change in the food system.
Great. Great. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and maybe if everyone can kind of think of a fairly quick response to it. I know there's a hard stop at 11. I know Damien, Rachel and I are all on the call coming up here in a minute. So interesting question. And again, I'm going to extend it just a little bit around what funders can do to support this work. What can funders, policymakers, and other partners do to support this work? And I think the thing I may be even more interested in, how do we, and you've been touching on, all of you have been touching on it, how do we overcome unintentional consequences of past ways of doing things? Like, how do we rewrite the script in ways that could lead to a better outcome in resilience building than maybe the way the practices are done now? And I'd love to hear if everyone can kind of give a short response. This will probably be our closing moment, knowing that we have 7 minutes, and we probably could have an hour-and-a-half conversation just about this. So Damien, I see you're off mute, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So I apologize for coughing while you were speaking. Oh, it was in my mind. It has to start with an acknowledgement of the past. And it has to include an understanding and a really frank conversation about the role that institutions play in perpetuating oppressive structures. You know, for me, that's just like so crucial because, you know, in many of these conversations, I feel like we have barriers that are difficult to negotiate because there's not that kind of simple recognition that, you know, we're all good people. Like, we all want to be good people and are super nice, and maybe we want to, you know, have a glass of wine together. But in our institutional roles, right, we are doing something different, right? We are perpetuating systems. You know, sometimes it feels unconsciously, sometimes it feels very conscious. But I just kind of feel like that acknowledgement of the history, and then the recognition that that continues to be perpetuated through large institutions is pretty crucial.
I'll actually build on Damien's point and say for funders to get in-house together, because it's hard to support racial equity and social justice work when there hasn't been work in the organization to better understand what the issues are, how they work, how they're impacting the organization itself in the way it operates, in the way that it is therefore then engaging with communities. And so, because if we're not doing that work in our organizations, again, to Damien's point, the system that we keep talking about is us people. We create these organizations, we decide on policies, we vote people into offices, we're the ones who show up in spaces, and we're not always our best selves. And so how do we make sure that we own our power and responsibilities in our organizations, so that our dysfunction does not spill out into the communities that we're trying to help, and that we ensure that we're not trying to just help them, but that we're partnering with them and we see them as equal partners. And that sometimes that means we have to invest in those communities being able to help build out their infrastructure, their civic infrastructure, to be able to fully engage in these types of relationships and conversations, and not use it as a reason to not invest in or partner with communities.
Dive in a little bit. I think I'm hearing from folks, you know, talking about capitalism, and this is the way that the system is built. And it really is. I mean, this country was built on extractive capitalism, and that's the system that we continue to operate with today. You know, the way that institutions operate, all the things that we're seeing today, whether it be climate change or wealth inequality, systemic racism, you know, food insecurity, these are all byproducts of how we manage institutions, wicked problems that are unintended consequences for the most part, sometimes intended consequences by bad players. But it's how we manage our institutions and the outcomes that we're looking for. You know, if we're operating under the assumption that our driving factor should be how do we feed a global population of 8 billion people, well, that singular focus is going to cause us to make decisions that are not going to benefit all people. And rather, we need to be looking at what is ecologically and socially appropriate for communities of all different types, and how can we embrace that rather than having that single focus on a certain metric. And so I think taking that more holistic perspective of how ecosystems and institutions operate and really embracing that, and for funders, less hawkish focus on what are the exact outcomes you're going to be able to deliver us in 3 years or 5 years based on X amount of funding that we give you, and rather sitting back and trusting the organizations to be able to say, I know that you have the right intentions, I know that you're doing what is necessary. And when you're working with the natural world, things are slow to move sometimes, and there's lots of adapting that has to happen along the way. And really embracing that and acknowledging that, I think, will go a long way towards the work that needs to be done.
Great, thanks. So we have 2 minutes. I need one to close. So Michael, you want to start, and then we can follow up with Rachel and Rebecca. I think this is the start of a conversation, hopefully. So
yeah.
I see you off mute, so fire away.
I don't have anything super profound. I have something a little bit more tactical, building on what's been said, which is funders often, because to Bobby's point, they want KPIs that show impact. They tend to fund in sectors and silos around particular things, but the magic of the food system is its connectivity to all these other issues. And so what funders could do very, tactically, is to think about things in more integrated, think about their funding in more integrated ways that promoted the organizations and partners they're working with to work in this more connective and integrated way.
Great, thank you. Well, this is the bummer of being virtual, not in person. I know that if this panel were just ending, there would be a whole conversation that would flow into the hallways, which doesn't get to happen here. So we are grateful for all of you and the work that you've been doing and taking some time out of your day to share with us. As I said at the beginning of this call, I think this is the tip of the iceberg, or just us starting to scratch the surface around some very important topics. And as we in Colorado think about building resilient food systems, us getting grounded in this type of feedback and insight is instrumental. So don't be surprised if you hear from us again. I think on the National Western Center side, we're committed to working with partners and organizations to continue these dialogues, both in these types of formats. And Atyia, I love the framing around how do we do these learning experiences kind of from the inside out. And I think this is hopefully helpful for a lot of folks. I think that there's other methods and approaches like getting on the bus. I'm not sure what getting on the bus means in rural Colorado, but how we do that in a way that really gets to ground and builds the relationships and listens in kind of a deep, empathetic way that we can build toward the future. So thanks again. Appreciate the time. Our commitment is to follow up with the link and resources to those who are listening in, and have a great week. Take care.